Can you imagine? The one who takes everything you have, not an enemy, not a stranger, but the very child you sacrificed your whole life to raise. At 68, Evelyn Hart was robbed of everything by her own son. Her bank account, her home, and her dignity. He thought she was finished, but he didn't know she was waiting. If you want to know what happens when a mother pushed to the brink finally rises up, watch to the end. Like and comment the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far my story has progressed. I've told this story to exactly 3 people in my life before today. The first was a woman named Gloria at the Millhaven Women's Shelter, who sat across from me at a folding table with 2 paper cups of coffee between us and listened without saying a single word until I finished. Then she reached over and put her hand on top of mine and said, "Honey, that boy was never going to be who you needed him to be." The second was my attorney, Frank Delaney, who heard it all through a glass partition at his downtown office and took notes in a yellow legal pad with a mechanical pencil, and when I was done, he looked at me over the rim of his reading glasses and said, "Mrs. Hart, I think you need to see something." The third was myself. At 2 in the morning, lying on a cot in a room I shared with 5 other women, whispering the whole thing into the dark because I needed to hear it out loud to believe it had actually happened. Now I'm telling you. I'm not telling it because I want sympathy. I'm 68 years old and I have been through enough to know that sympathy doesn't pay a utility bill or put groceries in a refrigerator. I'm telling it because there is something in this story that I think someone out there needs to hear. Maybe it's a warning, maybe it's something else. I'll let you decide what it is for you, but I'm going to tell it straight, and I'm not going to pretty it up, because the truth of what happened to me doesn't need decoration. It's ugly enough on its own. My name is Evelyn Hart, and for 41 years I lived in a double-wide trailer on a 2-acre lot on the east side of Clover County, a place so flat and quiet that on clear nights you could hear the grain elevator humming 3 miles away like some giant mechanical heartbeat. The trailer had been my home since 1983, when my husband Ray and I bought it with a down payment we'd scraped together from 18 months of double shifts and Sunday overtime. Ray died in 2009. A stroke, sudden, while he was sitting in his recliner watching a baseball game. The doctors said he probably never felt a thing. I felt everything. After Ray was gone, I had one constant in my life, and that constant was Derek. Derek Ray Hart, my son. Born November 14, 1981, 7 pounds and 4 ounces, screaming so loud in the delivery room that the nurse laughed and said, "That one knows exactly what he wants." She had no idea how right she was. For 27 years after his father died, I built my entire existence around Derek. I don't say that to make myself sound noble. I say it because it's the truth. And if I'm honest, really honest, some of that was my own doing. I let it happen. I encouraged it. When Derek struggled, I filled the gap. When Derek failed, I covered the wound. When Derek asked, I gave. I told myself it was love, and it was, in the beginning. But somewhere along the way, love became something else. Something that looked like love on the surface, but functioned more like surrender. I paid off Derek's first car loan when he was 24 because he'd lost his job at the distribution center and couldn't make the payments. That was $2,300. I paid his rent for 7 months when he and his then-girlfriend Cassandra split up and he couldn't cover the apartment on his own. That was another $4,000. When he started his landscaping business in 2016, I gave him $12,000 from the account Ray and I had kept untouched for 15 years as emergency savings. Derek called it an investment. He signed a paper that said he'd pay it back with 5% interest within 3 years. He never paid back a cent. I never asked him to. That was my mistake. I thought asking would damage something between us. I thought the act of asking would mean I didn't trust him. And I wanted so desperately to trust him that I let the debt dissolve just to protect the feeling of closeness between us. That closeness, it turned out, was largely something I had invented. The first sign that something was wrong, the first sign I let myself actually see, anyway, came in the spring of 2 years ago when I noticed my checking account balance was lower than it should have been. Now, I'll be honest. At 68, I wasn't doing spreadsheets. I kept a running mental tally of what I had, what the bills were, what was left over. I'd done it that way for 40 years, and it had never failed me. I knew my numbers the way some people know hymns, not by reading them, but by heart. So when I logged onto the bank's website to check my balance before paying my electric bill, and the number on the screen was $312 less than what I'd calculated, I didn't panic. I thought I'd miscounted. I thought maybe the phone company had pulled their payment a day early. I went through the transaction history. There it was. A withdrawal. $312, made at an ATM 3 towns over. The date was a Tuesday. On that Tuesday, I had been home all day. I had not left the property. I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I called Derek. He answered on the 3rd ring, his voice bright and easy the way it always was when he didn't know yet what you were calling about. "Hey, Mom, what's up?" "Derek," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Did you use my debit card?" There was a pause, just a hair too long. "What?" "My debit card. There's a withdrawal from Tuesday that I don't recognize. $312 from an ATM in Harlan." Another pause. "Oh yeah," he said, and his voice shifted, just slightly, the way it always did when he was transitioning into a story. "I was going to tell you about that. I had a situation with a supplier and I needed cash fast. And I knew you had your card in the junk drawer, so I grabbed it. I was going to put it back before you noticed, but then I got slammed with this job and, Mom, I'll put it back. I'll transfer it tomorrow." "Derek, you took my card without asking me." "I know, Mom. I'm sorry. It was a split-second thing. I didn't want to bother you." I remember closing my eyes and pressing my fingers against the bridge of my nose. I remember thinking, this is not the first time. I remember thinking that, and then immediately pushing the thought away. "Just let me know next time," I said, "please." "Absolutely. Mom, you know I would never... You know I've got you, right? You're my number one. Always." He transferred the $312 the next day, and I let myself believe that was the end of it. It wasn't. Over the next 4 months, I found 7 more unauthorized transactions. They ranged from $60 to over $400. Each time, Derek had an explanation, a supplier, a deposit for a job, an emergency with his truck. Each time, he promised to pay it back. Sometimes he did. Smaller amounts quickly, just enough to keep me from drawing a clear line. That, I came to understand much later, was intentional. He was managing me the way you manage a person who might otherwise become a problem. Small payments here and there, not enough to cancel out the total, but enough to keep me from becoming alarmed. Enough to give me something to point to when the doubt crept in. See? He paid back the 60. He paid back the 120. He's trying. In September of last year, Derek came by the trailer on a Sunday afternoon. He brought a bag of groceries. Nothing fancy, just a rotisserie chicken from the grocery store and a half-gallon of orange juice and a box of those butter cookies I like. He sat at my kitchen table and we talked for 2 hours about nothing important. His business. The weather. A neighbor's dog that kept getting into my garden. Normal things. Easy things. It felt like the old days when Derek was young and we'd sit at the same table after dinner and he'd tell me about school or whatever was on his mind, and I'd listen, and it felt like the two of us were enough. Like we were a complete unit, just the two of us against whatever came. When he got up to leave, he hugged me. He held on longer than usual. "I love you, Mom," he said into my shoulder. "I love you too," I said. He left. I stood at the screen door and watched his truck back out of the gravel drive and turn onto the county road. I watched until the taillights disappeared. What I didn't know, what I had absolutely no way of knowing while I stood there with that warm, fragile feeling in my chest, was that Derek had spent part of that afternoon going through my filing cabinet in the back bedroom while I was rinsing dishes in the kitchen. He had found my bank statements. He had found my account numbers. He had found the information he needed. Well, 3 weeks later, I went to the bank to withdraw $300 for a plumber who was coming the following Monday to fix a slow drain under the bathroom sink. The teller, a young woman named Brianne, who had helped me for years and always asked about my tomatoes, looked at her screen, then looked at me, then back at the screen. "Mrs. Hart," she said carefully, "can you give me just 1 moment?" She got up and went to the back. She was gone for 4 minutes. I counted. She came back with her manager, a heavy-set man named Dennis, whose collar was slightly too tight. "Mrs. Hart," Dennis said, folding his hands on the counter, "I want to make sure I'm reading this right. Are you aware of the recent activity on your account?" "What activity?" He turned the monitor slightly so I could see it. The account balance was $47. I remember the exact sensation in my chest when I saw that number. It wasn't panic, not immediately. It was more like the feeling of stepping onto a stair that isn't there. That split second of zero gravity, of free fall, before your brain catches up with what's happening. "That can't be right," I said. "There were a series of transfers over the past 11 days, Dennis said. His voice was professionally gentle, the kind of gentle that told me this was not the first time he'd had this conversation with someone. "Online banking. The login credentials were used remotely. The funds were moved to an external account into multiple transactions, just under the threshold that would trigger an automatic review." Just under the threshold. 11 days. Multiple transactions. "How much?" I asked. Dennis hesitated. "In total, approximately $14,260 were moved out of the account." $14,260. That was everything I had. 11 months of careful, calculated savings. The small amount of life insurance Ray had left behind. The money I'd built up since Derek took the $12,000 in 2016 and never paid it back. Every dollar I had in the world, except for 47. My knees went soft. I grabbed the counter's edge. "Mrs. Hart, do you have someone we can call?" I almost laughed at that. I almost said, "The person you'd call is the person who did this." I filed a police report that same afternoon. The officer who took it was a young man, maybe 26, who typed with 2 fingers and asked clarifying questions in a voice so flat and uninflected that I couldn't tell whether he was bored or simply exhausted. He explained that bank fraud investigations could take months, that the transfers had been made using login credentials, which complicated things, that without more direct evidence of who specifically accessed the account, it would be difficult to move quickly. "Do you have any idea who might have done this?" he asked. I sat with that question for a long moment. "My son," I said. The officer looked up from his keyboard. "Your son," he repeated. "His name is Derek Hart. He's 42 years old. He was at my home approximately 3 weeks ago and had access to my filing cabinet where I keep my account information." The officer typed something, then he looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite categorize. Not quite pity, not quite skepticism, something in between. "Mrs. Hart, are you certain you want to pursue this? Because if it does turn out to be a family member, it can get—" "I know what it can get," I said. "Please take down the name." He took down the name. I called Derek from the parking lot outside the police station. He didn't answer. I called again. Nothing. I texted, "Derek, I need you to call me right now. This is serious." The message showed as delivered. Then, a few seconds later, as read. He never called back. The trailer. I have to tell you about the trailer, because that was the part I didn't see coming, even after everything else, even after the bank account, even after the police report, even after 3 days of calling and getting nothing. I still had the trailer. I still had the 2 acres and the worn floorboards and the garden on the south side where I grew tomatoes and snap beans every summer. I still had Ray's recliner in the corner of the living room. I still had home. Or so I believed. On a Friday morning, 7 days after the bank account, a truck I didn't recognize pulled into my gravel drive. 2 men got out. Professionals, polite, clipboards in hand. One of them knocked on my screen door. "Ma'am, we're from Pemberton Property Management. We're here to do an initial walkthrough for the new owner." I stared at him through the screen. "New owner?" I said. "Yes, ma'am. This property changed hands last Thursday. We were told the current occupant was aware of the transfer." I felt the ground shift again. That same zero-gravity sensation. "I am the current occupant," I said slowly. "I am Evelyn Hart, and I have owned this property since 1983. The man with the clipboard looked uncomfortable. He pulled out a document and held it up to the screen. "Ma'am, we have a signed deed of transfer dated last Thursday. The seller listed is Evelyn M. Hart." Let me see that. He passed it through the gap in the door. I looked at it. I looked at the signature line. Evelyn M. Hart. That was my name. That was my middle initial. But that was not my signature. It was close. It was impressively, frighteningly close. Someone had practiced it. But I have had the same signature for 50 years. The way the E loops back on itself. The way the H in Hart sits slightly lower than it should. And this was not it. This was a forgery. A good one, but a forgery. My son had sold my home. He had forged my signature, sold my home out from under me while I was still living in it, and walked away with whatever the sale price was. I sat down on the porch steps because I couldn't stand anymore. The man from Pemberton Property Management stood there not knowing what to do. His partner hung back near the truck. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "is there someone I can call for you?" I will tell you what the next 2 weeks looked like because I think it matters. I made calls, dozens of them. I called the county recorder's office. I called a lawyer, the only one whose name I knew offhand, Frank Delaney, who'd done Ray's will back in 2008. I called the bank again. I called the police again and gave them the forged deed on top of the original report. I called Derek 47 times across those 2 weeks. He answered once, on the 9th day, at 11:30 at night, and all he said was, "Mom, stop calling me. This is harassment." Harassment. That was the word my son used. After what he'd done, after wiping out my savings and forging my name and selling the home I'd lived in since before he was born, the word he chose was harassment. I didn't cry when he said it. I was past crying by then. I felt something else instead, something colder and more solid, something that settled into my chest like ballast. I had spent 42 years loving Derek Hart and protecting Derek Hart and making excuses for Derek Hart, and in return he had stolen $14,000, forged my signature on a legal document, sold my home, and called me a harasser. "Derek," I said, "I want you to hear me very clearly. What you have done is a crime, multiple crimes, and I am going to see them through." Silence. "Goodbye, son," I said. I hung up. I turned off my phone and put it in my purse. Then I sat in my car in the parking lot of a 24-hour diner because I had nowhere else to go, and I let myself feel what I'd been holding off feeling for 2 weeks. I was 68 years old. I had $47 in a bank account. I had a car with 230,000 miles on it. I had a suitcase and 2 garbage bags of belongings I'd managed to grab before the Pemberton men came back with legal paperwork. I had no home, no family, and no plan. I was alone in a way I hadn't been since the night Ray died, except this time the loneliness wasn't grief. It was something sharper than grief. It was the loneliness of betrayal, of having extended your whole self to another person and finding out they had taken what they wanted and left the rest. I sat in that parking lot until 3 in the morning. Then I started the car and drove to the Millhaven Women's Shelter, which I had only ever known as a building I'd passed on Whitmore Street, and I went inside, and I asked for help. But the shelter was nothing like I'd feared and nothing like I'd imagined. It was clean and quiet and smelled like institutional coffee and the particular brand of dish soap they buy in bulk. There were rules. Lights out at 10, no alcohol on premises, mandatory check-in, and the rules felt, in some strange way, like relief. After weeks of freefall, something with edges to it. The woman at the intake desk that first night was tired-looking and efficient and kind in a businesslike way that I appreciated. She didn't offer me sympathy, and she didn't look at me with that particular expression I had grown to dread. The one that said, "How did you end up here?" She just asked the necessary questions, gave me a bed assignment, and handed me a towel in a small bag with a travel toothbrush and a bar of soap. "Breakfast is at 7, she said. "Sleep." I slept. I woke up the next morning in a room with 5 other women, all of us over 50, all of us with our own wreckage behind us, and I lay there in the blue-gray light of early morning and thought, I have nothing. I have absolutely nothing. And underneath that thought, so quiet I almost missed it, was another one. You have time. You have a clear head. And you have 40 years of documents in a suitcase. That was the thing about me that Derek had underestimated. He had looked at me and seen an old woman in a trailer, a soft target, someone who would be devastated and confused and too ashamed to fight back, someone whose world was small enough that destroying it would be easy and rebuilding it would be impossible. He wasn't entirely wrong. I was devastated. I was confused, at least in the beginning. And the shame, I'll be honest about the shame, because I think anyone who's been in this situation knows it. The shame was its own kind of weight. The shame of being someone whose child did this to her. The shame of not having seen it coming. The shame of sitting in a shelter bed at 68 years old. But Derek had made one fundamental miscalculation about his mother. He thought I had nothing left. He forgot about the box. The box was a gray plastic storage container about the size of a shoebox but deeper that had lived on the top shelf of my bedroom closet for 22 years. I'd shoved it up there in 2003 when I was reorganizing, and I hadn't looked inside it since. It held, as far as I remembered, a collection of old documents, insurance records, a copy of Ray's discharge papers from the Army, property records going back to the original deed on the trailer, a few envelopes that I'd filed away and half forgotten. I'd grabbed it automatically, on instinct, when I was throwing things into bags in the hours before the Pemberton men came back. It wasn't a considered decision. My hands just reached for it. 3 weeks into my stay at the shelter, on a Wednesday afternoon when the common room was quiet and most of the other women were at a job placement workshop, I sat down at one of the folding tables with a cup of bad coffee and opened the box. I spent 4 hours going through it. Most of it was what I remembered: insurance documents, Ray's Army records, a copy of our original mortgage from 1983 that I didn't even know I still had, old birthday cards from Derek when he was small, and his child's unsteady printing, a Valentine I'd made for Ray in 1987 out of red construction paper, things I had to set aside quickly because I wasn't ready for them yet. And then, near the bottom of the box, in a plain white envelope that I had no memory of putting there, a document. 14 pages, stapled together. The header on the first page read, Hart Family Revocable Trust, established June 12, 2001. I stared at it. I had no memory of this. Not a clear memory. But as I read the first page, something began to surface, a dim recollection of a meeting 22 years ago with a man named Gerald Aldous, who had been the attorney handling the estate of Ray's uncle Clarence, who had died that spring with no will and a complicated tangle of property in 3 counties. There had been a process. There had been documents. Ray had been named in Clarence's estate as a surviving relative with claim to a parcel of land, undeveloped acreage in Tiller County that nobody had thought much about at the time because the land was scrubby and remote and seemingly worthless. But Ray had been cautious, quietly, stubbornly cautious, in the way of a man who'd grown up poor and knew that the one time you got careless was the one time it cost you everything. He'd consulted with Gerald Aldous, and Aldous had set up a trust, simple, protective. The land went into the trust. The trust had a beneficiary. That beneficiary was Derek Hart, or rather, it had been Derek Hart. I turned to page 9 of the document and found what I was looking for. An amendment, dated March 2019, filed through Gerald Aldous' office. The amendment removed Derek as beneficiary. I read the reason listed. Then I read it again. My hands were shaking by the time I finished. The amendment had been filed. I had apparently filed it, though I had no clear memory of doing so, which told me it had been a dark, grief-raw period, and I had done it and then packed the evidence away somewhere deep. In response to Derek's behavior during a specific incident in 2018, when he had attempted to access the trust accounts using a power of attorney document that he had forged. Gerald Aldous had caught it. He had reported it to me, and I, in some version of myself that had more backbone than I usually gave myself credit for, had immediately executed the amendment. Derek had been removed as beneficiary in 2019 because of a fraud he committed in 2018. And then I had buried the document in a box in my closet, and in the long fog of getting older and managing day-to-day survival and allowing myself to believe that my son was not what the evidence said he was, I had forgotten it existed. The trust itself, I read through the remaining pages with growing, stunned disbelief, had grown substantially. The Tiller County land, which had seemed worthless in 2001, sat adjacent to an area that had been quietly annexed and developed over the past decade. Gerald Aldous had apparently been managing the trust all this time, conservative and meticulous, and the land's assessed value had increased by a factor I couldn't quite believe the first time I read it. I sat at that folding table in the shelter's common room for a long time after I finished reading. Gloria, the woman who would later tell me that Derek was never going to be who I needed him to be, came and sat across from me at some point. She saw my face, and she didn't ask questions. She just put 2 fresh cups of coffee on the table and sat with me. "Good news or bad news?" she asked eventually. I thought about Derek's voice on the phone. "Stop calling me. This is harassment." I thought about the forged deed, the $14,260, the groceries he'd brought that Sunday, and the hug that went on a little too long, and the way he'd stood in my kitchen while I rinsed dishes and gone through my files like I was a mark. I thought about 42 years. "Both," I said. Gloria nodded slowly. "That's usually how it goes." I called Frank Delaney the next morning. I hadn't had a reason to speak to Frank since he'd helped me update Ray's estate paperwork in 2015, but he was the only lawyer I knew, and when I explained what I'd found, there was a pause on his end of the line, and then he said carefully, "Mrs. Hart, I'd like you to come in. Can you come in this week?" "I can come in today," I said. "Come in today," he agreed. I put on the best thing I had from my suitcase, a gray blazer I'd bought for my nephew's wedding 3 years ago, and I drove to Frank's office downtown and sat across from him at his desk and laid out every document I had: the trust, the amendment, the police report, the forged deed, the bank statements, the text messages. Frank read through everything with that yellow legal pad in front of him, making notes in his small, precise handwriting. He didn't rush. He didn't react outwardly to anything. When he finally looked up and removed his reading glasses, his expression was measured and serious. "Mrs. Hart," he said, "I think you need to see something." He turned his monitor around so I could see it. He had pulled up the current assessed value of the Tiller County parcels. I had read the number in the trust documents, but seeing it confirmed on a county assessor's screen in plain numbers, it was different. It made it real in a way the paper hadn't, quite. "That's current?" I asked. "As of the last assessment cycle, yes." I sat with that for a moment. "And Derek doesn't know," I said. It wasn't really a question. The trust was never in his name after 2019. He has no record of it. Gerald Aldis retired 2 years ago and transferred his files to a colleague, but the trust has been properly maintained and documented throughout. "So he stole my savings," I said, working through it slowly. "And he forged my signature and sold my property, and he thinks he's won." Frank folded his hands on the desk. "That would appear to be his current operating assumption, yes." I thought about Derek's voice. This is harassment. I thought about him walking away without looking back. I thought about myself at 3 in the morning in a diner parking lot with $47 and nowhere to go. "What do we do first?" I asked. Frank picked up his yellow legal pad. "First," he said, "we make sure everything is properly documented and secured. Second, we address the criminal matters, the bank fraud and the forged deed. Those need to move forward regardless of the trust situation." And then, he allowed himself a small, careful expression. Not a smile exactly. Something more like the satisfaction of a man who had been practicing law for 30 years and occasionally got to watch the right thing happen. "And then," Frank said, "we wait. Because sooner or later, Mrs. Hart, your son is going to hear about this land." I thought about that. I thought about Derek, greedy, impatient, certain that the world owed him something and that I was too old and too weak to stop him from taking it. I thought about what it would feel like to watch him walk into a trap he'd built himself, brick by brick, out of every choice he'd ever made. "How long?" I asked. "These things move at their own pace," Frank said, "but I wouldn't worry too much about the timeline." He leaned forward slightly. "The document says what it says, Mrs. Hart, and what it says is very clear." I nodded. I gathered my papers carefully and put them back in the white envelope. I stood up, smoothed the front of my blazer, and picked up my purse. "Thank you, Frank," I said. "Mrs. Hart," he said, standing as I turned toward the door. I looked back at him. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think you're one of the strongest people I've ever had in that chair." I didn't say anything to that. I just nodded once and walked out. But in the elevator down to the parking garage, alone, I pressed my back against the wall and closed my eyes, and let out a breath that felt like it had been lodged somewhere behind my ribs for months. I wasn't finished. I was 68 years old, and I had $47 in a storage box and a document that my son didn't know existed, and I was not even close, finished. Frank Delaney was not a man who used the word patient lightly. When he said it to me that day in his office, "These things move at their own pace, Mrs. Hart," I understood he was telling me something practical, something rooted in 30 years of watching courts move the way rivers move. Mostly slow, occasionally violent, never on anyone's schedule but their own. I had nodded like I understood. I had walked out of his office standing straight. But patience, when you are 68 years old and sleeping in a shelter bed and eating scrambled eggs from an industrial-sized aluminum tray every morning, is a different animal than patience in theory. I had a lot of time to think. That was both the gift and the punishment of those early weeks at Millhaven. The shelter's days had a structure, meals, workshops, quiet hours, but the structure left long stretches of empty time in between. And empty time, when your life has just been demolished, is not restful. It's archaeological. You go through the rubble again and again, turning pieces over, looking for the moment you missed, the warning you ignored, the thing you should have done differently. I found plenty. I found the moment in 2016 when I handed Derek that $12,000 and watched him fold it into his jacket pocket without quite meeting my eyes. I found the Sunday afternoon visits that had started feeling more like inspections than company. The way Derek would move through my rooms with a kind of casual inventory, eyes tracking shelves and drawers. I found the dozens of small dismissals over the years, the times he'd talked over me at family dinners, corrected me in front of his friends, told me I was being dramatic or paranoid when I raised concerns. I had called those things his personality, his rough edges, things I loved him through. Sitting in the shelter common room with bad coffee and nothing but time, I started calling them what they actually were. But grief is grief, even when the person you're grieving is still alive and perfectly healthy and simply doesn't care what he's done to you. And grief isn't linear, no matter how much you want it to be. There were mornings I woke up angry, that clean, functional anger that gets things done. And there were mornings I woke up and just stared at the ceiling and felt nothing but the weight of all those years. Gloria noticed both versions. "You're different today," she said one morning in late October, sitting across from me at breakfast. She was a sturdy woman in her early 60s with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses she kept on a beaded chain. She'd been at the shelter longer than almost anyone, working as a volunteer coordinator after aging out of the residential program. She had her own wreckage, an ex-husband who'd drained their joint accounts and disappeared, a daughter who'd stopped speaking to her for reasons she described only as complicated. She did not offer easy comfort, and I appreciated her for it. "Different how?" I asked. "Clearer," she said. She studied me over the rim of her coffee cup. "Like you made a decision about something." I thought about Frank's office, about the trust documents in the white envelope, now locked in the shelter's document safe, along with my other important papers, about the number on the county assessor's screen. "I think I did," I said. "Good," Gloria said. She went back to her eggs. "Anger is better than sad. Sad just sits there. Anger at least moves." She was right. I was learning that anger, properly directed, is not destructive. It's structural. It gives you something to organize yourself around. I was organizing. Frank called me the second week of November with an update on the criminal investigation. His voice was measured, but I'd been listening to it long enough by then to hear the thing underneath the measure. A controlled satisfaction, the tone of a man whose paperwork was going in the right direction. "The forgery investigation has moved faster than I expected," he said. "The county sheriff's office brought in a documents examiner. The signature on the deed transfer has been formally identified as inconsistent with your authenticated signature samples, meaning they know it was forged, meaning the examiner's report says exactly that, in the precise language that prosecutors need it to say, yes." I was sitting in a small phone room off the shelter's main hallway, 3 walls and a curtain and just enough quiet to have a real conversation. I pressed the phone harder against my ear. And Derek? He's been contacted by the sheriff's office. He has retained an attorney, which means he knows this is serious. What kind of attorney? A criminal defense attorney, Frank said. Someone out of Brenham. Reasonably competent, from what I understand. His name is Caulfield. I filed that away. Caulfield. Frank, what's the timeline on the bank fraud? The bank's fraud division has completed their internal investigation and referred the matter to the DA's office. The login credentials were traced to a device registered in Derek's name. Combined with the ATM withdrawals and the pattern of smaller transactions you documented over the preceding months, it builds a picture, Mrs. Hart. It's not one action. It's a pattern. And patterns are what prosecutors like. Well, I thought about Derek sitting somewhere, his apartment, or maybe some newer, nicer place he'd rented with my money. Talking to his criminal defense attorney, working out what to say. I wondered if he was scared. I wondered, honestly, if he was. I thought I knew my son well enough to guess the answer, and the answer was, not yet. Not fully. He had always been the kind of person who didn't believe consequences were coming until they actually arrived. One more thing, Frank said. The property sale. What about it? Pemberton Property Management has been cooperative. They're not in legal trouble. They processed what appeared to be a legitimate transaction, but they have an obvious interest in getting ahead of this. The company that purchased the property has been notified of the fraud claim and is cooperating with the investigation. They want clean title, which means they're not fighting the reversal. I went still. Frank, are you saying what? I'm saying the process is moving in the right direction. It's not finished, and I don't want to give you a date because dates have a way of disappointing people. But the legal pathway to restoring your property rights is open, and it's moving. I sat in that small phone room for a moment after we hung up, my hand still on the receiver, staring at the curtain. I thought about the trailer, the south garden, Ray's recliner, the way the kitchen smelled in the morning when I made coffee with the window cracked open and the early air came in cool and smelling of grass. I thought, hold on. Chet. But here's what I didn't know was happening on Derek's end during those weeks. I only learned the full shape of it later, from Frank, from court documents, and eventually from Derek himself, though the version Derek told had significant gaps where the truth was inconvenient. But I've pieced it together well enough, and I'll tell you what I understand to be true. Derek had not expected the criminal investigation to move as quickly as it did. He had counted on the thing that a lot of people count on when they steal from elderly family members, the assumption that shame will do the silencing, that the victim will be too humiliated, too confused, or too emotionally invested to push a case against their own child through a system that is slow and exhausting and asks you to retell your worst moments to strangers over and over again. He had underestimated me. He had made that calculation based on the version of me that had always given him what he needed, the version that covered his debts and forgave his defaults, and told herself it was love when it was actually fear. Fear of losing him, fear of being alone, fear of becoming the mother whose son didn't come around anymore. That version of me was gone. She had died somewhere between the bank teller's screen showing $47 and the parking lot at 3 a.m, and what replaced her was something older and quieter and a lot less willing to absorb a blow without hitting back. What I learned was that in early November, around the time Frank was telling me about the documents examiner, Derek had started hearing things. He ran in certain circles, contractors, small developers, people who talked over drinks about land and money and opportunity, and in those circles the name Tiller County had started coming up. Not in connection with anything specific yet, just as a place that was moving, a place where land was changing hands and values were shifting in ways that suggested something larger was coming. Derek had a gift for sniffing out opportunity. It was one of the things that had made him seem promising for years. That restless, acquisitive intelligence, always looking for the angle, the opening, the deal. It was also one of the things that had ultimately destroyed him. Because a person who sees everything as an angle eventually starts seeing people that way too. He made some calls. He talked to a guy who knew a county planning official. He did some digging, and somewhere in that digging he came across the name Gerald Aldis. The connection was loose at first, a property filing, a trust reference, a name attached to acreage in Tiller County. But Derek was patient when it suited him, and he kept pulling the thread. By mid-November, he knew about the trust. He didn't know about the amendment. That detail would come later, and it would arrive like a verdict. Frank called me again on a Monday morning in late November. I was at the shelter's computer station working on a job application for a part-time administrative position at a medical billing office. Not because I needed the income desperately yet, but because I needed to feel useful. I needed to feel like I was building something, even something small. I saw Frank's name on my phone screen and I stepped away from the computer. "He knows," Frank said without preamble. "About the trust?" He contacted Gerald Aldis's former colleague, a woman named Patricia Hess, who took over the practice. He went in person, apparently, showed up at her office and told her he was your son, and he'd recently become aware of a trust that named him as beneficiary, and he wanted information about how to access it. I closed my eyes for a moment. What did Patricia Hess do? Exactly what she should have done. She told him she couldn't discuss trust matters with him without proper documentation of his standing, and she called me immediately after he left her office. He didn't know about the amendment. No, and he left Patricia's office still not knowing. He knows a trust exists. He knows it's connected to Tiller County land. He believes he's the beneficiary. I thought about Derek, the way his mind would have worked in that office. The calculations running behind his eyes, the size of the number multiplied by whatever figure he'd gotten from his contacts, and all of it landing in his head like a match dropped into dry grass. "He's going to push," I said. "Aggressively," Frank agreed. "I expect we'll hear from his attorney within the week." "Let him push," I said. There was a brief pause. "Mrs. Hart, when he finds out about the amendment, and he will find out, it's going to escalate. I want you to be prepared for that." "I've been preparing for 42 years, I said. "I think I can manage another few weeks." Caulfield, Derek's attorney, contacted Frank on a Thursday. Frank relayed the conversation to me in detail because he knew I wanted every word. Caulfield had been professional but aggressive, using the tone of a man accustomed to moving things through sheer forward pressure. He'd claimed that Derek, as a direct heir and longtime named beneficiary, had substantial rights regarding the Hart family revocable trust, and that any attempt to exclude him would be legally challenged. Frank had listened. He had not been rushed. He had said, in his measured way, that he would review the relevant documents and respond in due course. What he hadn't said, not yet, not to Caulfield, was that the amendment existed. He was letting Derek's attorney make the argument, letting him build it out, letting Derek feel, for just a little longer, like this was a fight he could win. "Strategy," Frank told me. "Let them commit to a position before you show them why the position is wrong. It's harder to retreat from a committed position." I thought about that. "How long do we let them commit?" "Long enough that the reversal is decisive," Frank said. "Trust me on the timing." I did. It was the first time in a long time I'd trusted anyone's judgment but my own, and it was not a comfortable feeling. But Frank had given me no reason to doubt him, and more importantly, he was the only person other than Gloria who had looked me in the eye and treated me like someone whose situation was serious and whose choices mattered. The weeks between Thanksgiving and Christmas were the strangest I had ever lived. On the surface, my life was small and circumscribed. The shelter, the job application, long walks around the neighborhood in the cold afternoon light because I needed to move and there was nowhere particular to go. Frank called twice a week with updates. The criminal cases were proceeding slowly, the way Frank had warned, but the pieces were in place and they were moving. And underneath all of it, running like a current, was the knowledge of what was coming. The thing Derek didn't know yet. The amendment sitting in a file folder in Frank Delaney's office like a loaded question, waiting for the right moment to be asked. I thought about Derek a lot during those weeks. Not always with anger, sometimes with a grief I couldn't quite name, a mourning for the person I'd believed he was, or maybe for the person I'd spent so many years needing him to be. A mother doesn't stop loving her child just because the child turns out to be someone who would do this. The love doesn't evaporate. It just becomes something you have to carry alongside the anger and the cold clarity and the hard knowledge that love, by itself, is not enough to make someone good. I thought about the little boy who'd printed, "I love you, Mom," in red crayon on a folded piece of construction paper. I thought about him, and then I thought about the man who'd called me a harasser from a number I'd dialed 47 times, and I tried to find the line between those two people. The point where one became the other, and I couldn't find it. Maybe there wasn't a line. Maybe they were always the same person, just at different ages, and the love I'd felt for the boy had made it impossible to see what the man was becoming. I had to stop doing that. I had to stop trying to understand it and just accept it. Gloria told me the same thing, more bluntly. "You keep trying to make it make sense," she said one evening. "It doesn't make sense. Some people just are what they are. And the sooner you stop looking for the why, the sooner you can put your energy somewhere that actually helps you." "I know," I said. "Knowing and doing are different things." "I know that too," I said. She almost smiled. "You're stubborn." "Apparently," I said. "Derek always called it something else." "I bet he did." Took. On a Tuesday in mid-December, Frank called me at 8:30 in the morning, which was earlier than he usually called. I was in the phone room with my coffee, already half-dressed for the day. "Derek's attorney has formally filed a claim," Frank said. "He's asserting that Derek is the rightful beneficiary of the Hart family revocable trust and is requesting full disclosure of trust assets and immediate transfer of control." He filed. "This morning, which means we now have an official legal proceeding, which means I can now respond officially." I set down my coffee cup. "The amendment," I said. "I'm filing the response this afternoon," Frank said. "It will include the full amendment documentation, the 2019 filing records, and the supporting materials from Gerald Aldis's files that Patricia Hess has made available. Every page, every signature, every date." I thought about Derek opening that response, sitting somewhere with Caulfield, reading through a document that proved his mother had removed him as beneficiary 7 years ago in direct response to a fraud he had committed against her, a fraud she had documented at the time and never told him she knew about. "Frank," I said, "when Caulfield reads that response, what happens?" "Caulfield is a professional. He'll recalibrate." "And Derek?" A brief pause. "Derek," Frank said carefully, "is going to be very angry." I thought about Derek's anger. I had spent years managing it, softening things to avoid it, shaping my words and my requests, and sometimes my whole life around the goal of not triggering it. I had mistaken that management for love. I had told myself I was keeping the peace. What I had actually been doing was handing him power over me, one accommodation at a time, until the weight of those accommodations had become the architecture of our entire relationship. I wasn't afraid of his anger anymore. What I felt, sitting in that small phone room with my cold coffee, thinking about Derek reading those pages, was something I hadn't expected and wasn't sure I had a word for. It wasn't satisfaction, exactly. It was quieter than that. It was the feeling of a door closing. A thing finally ending the way it should have ended years ago, the way it would have ended if I had been braver or clearer or less determined to hold on to something that was already long gone. "Let him be angry," I said. "Yes," said Frank. "Let him." I hung up. I sat for a moment in the quiet. Then I picked up my coffee, finished what was left of it even though it was cold, stood up, and went to find Gloria. She was in the common room, sorting through a box of donated coats for the winter distribution. She looked up when I came in, read something in my face, and set down the coat she was holding. "Well?" she said. "It started," I said. She nodded slowly. "How do you feel?" I thought about it honestly, the way I'd been learning to think about things, without the filter, without the softening. "Like I've been holding my breath for 2 months," I said, and I just breathed out. Gloria picked up the coat again. "Good," she said. "Now let's see what the boy does when the walls start closing in." Caulfield called Frank the morning after the response was filed. Frank told me about the conversation later that same day, relaying it with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned to report facts without editorializing, though I could hear something underneath the neutrality, something quiet and deliberate, like a person keeping a straight face at a card table. Caulfield had not been aggressive this time. The forward pressure was gone from his voice, Frank said. What replaced it was a more careful, probing tone. the sound of a man remapping terrain that had suddenly changed shape under his feet. He asked me to confirm the amendment was valid, Frank said. I confirmed it. He asked about the 2019 filing date, the process by which it was executed, the documentation supporting Gerald Aldis's involvement. I answered everything. All of it is clean, Mrs. Hart. Every date, every signature, every notarization. Gerald Aldis was meticulous. And then? And then Caulfield said he needed to consult with his client and would be in touch. I knew what that meant. It meant Caulfield had walked out of that phone call and gone directly to wherever Derek was and told him something that Derek had not been prepared to hear. It meant there was a conversation happening somewhere. Heated, probably, Derek's voice going up the way it always did when things weren't moving in his favor. That I was not part of and did not need to be part of. How long until they respond? I asked. Caulfield is competent, Frank said. He'll regroup quickly. I'd expect a formal challenge within 2 weeks. They'll argue the amendment was invalid, that you weren't of sound mind, that Aldis overstepped, that the process was flawed somehow. They'll find an angle. That's his job. But the amendment is valid. Completely. Which means their challenge fails. But they'll make us prove it, and proving it takes time and costs money. How much money? A brief pause. Let me worry about the billing for now, Frank said. You focus on staying steady. I wanted to argue with that. I didn't like the idea of Frank carrying costs on my behalf. It felt like another version of the dependency I was trying to dismantle. But I also knew my account balance, and I knew that arguing about it right then was a luxury I couldn't afford. All right, I said, I'll stay steady. I hung up and sat with the word for a minute. Steady. It was such a plain, unromantic word for what I was trying to do. Not brave, not strong, just steady, upright, forward-facing, not falling over. That was the whole goal. That was the entire ambition of my life in that period. It was harder than it sounds. The challenge came 11 days later, not 2 weeks. Caulfield was faster than Frank had estimated, which told me Derek was pushing hard. A man who's afraid of what the clock might reveal tends to want things to move quickly. The challenge document was 14 pages. Frank walked me through it on the phone, summarizing each argument in plain language, while I sat in the shelter's phone room with a legal pad and took notes in the margins. An old habit from the years when Ray and I had dealt with the trailer's mortgage, and I'd learned early that writing things down was the only way I trusted myself to remember them accurately. The arguments were, as Frank had predicted, aimed at the amendment's validity. Caulfield claimed that my mental state in 2019 had been compromised by grief and isolation following Ray's death a decade earlier, a characterization so grotesque in its inaccuracy that I had to put down my pen for a moment and breathe. He claimed that Gerald Aldis had acted outside the proper scope of his role. He claimed that the amendment had never been properly communicated to Derek, which, Frank noted dryly, was not actually a legal requirement for its validity, but was presumably included to generate sympathy. And then there was the last argument, the one that sat at the bottom of page 13 like a stone. Caulfield claimed that I had been unduly influenced by unnamed third parties to execute the amendment against my own interests and my son's rightful inheritance. Unduly influenced. I read the phrase 3 times. He's saying someone manipulated me into doing it, I said. That's the claim, yes, Frank said. It's the weakest argument in the document, legally speaking, but it's designed to be damaging rhetorically. It paints you as confused and controllable, which is exactly the image they want a judge to have. It's also exactly backwards, I said. I was unduly influenced for 42 years. The amendment was the first time I did something completely on my own. I know, Frank said, and we'll make sure the record reflects that. What I didn't tell Frank, what I barely told myself, was that reading that argument had cracked something open in me that I'd been keeping shut. Not because it was convincing, but because it was so specifically, surgically designed to use my own vulnerabilities against me. To take the years of accommodation, the history of being managed and softened and talked out of my own instincts, and weaponize them into a legal narrative that said, this woman can't be trusted to make her own decisions. Derek knew that story. He had lived inside it. He had helped write it. And now he was filing it in court. I put the legal pad face down on the table and pressed both hands flat on the back of it, and stayed like that for a while. Frank filed our response to the challenge on a Thursday in mid-January. I know the date because I wrote it in the margin of my legal pad and circled it, January 16th. Response filed. The response was comprehensive. Frank had obtained Gerald Aldis's complete case files through Patricia Hess. He had secured a sworn statement from Gerald Aldis himself. Retired but sharp, living in a house outside Brenham, apparently furious when he heard what Derek had attempted in 2018 and again now. The statement detailed every step of the 2019 amendment process: my request, the meetings, the documentation, the notarization. Aldis described me in his careful legal language as clear-minded, deliberate, and fully informed of the consequences of the amendment. The response also included something Caulfield had not anticipated: the 2018 incident report. When Derek had attempted to access the trust accounts using a forged power of attorney in 2018, Gerald Aldis had not simply reported it to me and moved on. He had documented it formally, filed a report with the state bar, and retained copies of the forged document in his files. That document, Derek's forged signature on a power of attorney bearing my name, sat now in Frank's response as Exhibit C, cross-referenced against the handwriting analysis already commissioned in connection with the forged property deed. One forged document could be minimized, explained away, called an aberration. Two forged documents separated by 6 years executed against the same victim formed a pattern. Patterns, as Frank had told me, were what prosecutors liked. Patterns were also, it turned out, what judges noticed. Bartsid, I need to tell you about the phone call because it changed something. It was a Sunday. Late afternoon, the light already going thin and gray outside the shelter's narrow windows. I was sitting on my cot going through a stack of papers. I had developed the habit of reviewing my documents periodically, partly out of practicality and partly, I think, because the act of handling them made me feel less powerless. When my phone rang, the number was Derek's. I stared at it for 4 rings. My thumb hovered. I thought about the last time I'd answered, the word harassment sitting in the air between us like something physical. I answered. Mom. His voice was different, quieter than I'd heard it in years, lower in register, stripped of the bright, easy confidence that had always been its signature quality. He sounded honestly like a person who hadn't slept. Derek, I said, a silence that lasted long enough that I thought the call might have dropped. I need to talk to you, he said. You're talking to me. Not like this, not on the phone. I need to... He stopped. I heard him exhale. Can I come see you, just to talk? No lawyers, no... No, I said. The word came out cleaner and steadier than I expected. No hesitation, no softening, just no. Mom, I just want to... Derek, I've heard your attorney's position. Everything you want to say to me, you can say through Frank Delaney. That's the way this works now. That's not... Mom, this is our family. This shouldn't be in a courtroom. I closed my eyes briefly. Our family. He was using the phrase like a tool, the same way he'd used the groceries and the hug and the Sunday afternoon visits, as leverage, as something he could put between himself and the consequences of what he'd done. Derek, I said, you made it a courtroom when you forged my name. The silence this time was different, heavier. I can explain that, he said finally, and his voice had taken on an edge, the defensiveness sliding in underneath the conciliation like a blade under a door. The property thing. That was a mistake, a bad decision. I was in a financial situation, and I panicked, and I know it was wrong. I know that you practiced my signature, I said. People don't practice a signature in a panic. They practice it in advance. Nothing. And the bank account, I said. $14,260. 11 days. 11 days, Derek, while I was living in that trailer not knowing. Was that a panic too? Mom, in 2018, the power of attorney, Gerald Aldis's files. The silence that followed was the longest yet. I counted seconds in my head. I got to 11 before he spoke. How do you know about 2018? Because Gerald Aldous documented everything, I said. Because I made an amendment in 2019 that you apparently thought would never come to light. Because I have been sitting in a shelter bed for months, Derek, going through every document I have, and the picture it makes is very clear. His voice, when it came back, was no longer conciliatory. The quietness was gone. What replaced it was something rawer, not quite anger, not quite desperation, something in the space between the two. That trust should be mine, he said. That land, it's family land. Dad would have wanted... Don't, I said. Don't put your father's name in this. I'm just saying, your father worked every day of his adult life. He built that account, and he kept his name clean, and he never once took what wasn't his. Don't put his name in this conversation. I was gripping the phone hard enough that my hand ached. I made myself loosen it. The amendment is valid, I said. Frank's response is on record. Everything Gerald Aldous documented is on record. The handwriting analysis is on record. Whatever you and Caulfield decide to do next, do it through the proper channels. Don't call this number again unless it's through an attorney. Mom, please. Goodbye, Derek. I ended the call. I sat on the cot for a long time afterward, not moving. My hands had developed a faint tremor. Not fear, I don't think, but the physical residue of doing something hard. Of holding a line I'd spent decades incapable of holding. I thought about him saying please. I thought about the sound of it, genuine or a very good performance of genuine. And I was no longer certain I could tell the difference when it came to Derek, and I wasn't sure I needed to be able to. What I knew was this. Love that is used as a crowbar is not love. And a door held open out of love can become the door a person walks through to take what they want. I had held that door open for 42 years. I was done holding it. I texted Frank. Derek called. I told him to go through you, wanted you to know. Frank texted back 12 minutes later. Good. I'll contact Caulfield in the morning. The court hearing was scheduled for the second week of February. The weeks leading up to it had a particular quality, a tightening, a narrowing of focus, the way I imagine the world narrows for an athlete before a competition. Everything unnecessary fell away. I ate, I slept, I walked, I reviewed documents with Frank. I talked to Gloria in the evenings. I didn't think about anything beyond what was immediately in front of me. But I need to tell you what I found out 3 days before the hearing because it reframed everything I thought I understood about the shape of Derek's situation. Frank called me on a Wednesday evening, again, earlier than usual, which had become a signal I'd learned to read. I received some information today from the DA's office, he said. It's relevant to the hearing, and I want you to hear it from me before it surfaces elsewhere. Tell me. Derek's landscaping business. The accounts. I waited. In the process of the fraud investigation, the DA's office obtained a subpoena for his business financial records. What they found is, it goes further than what he took from you, Mrs. Hart. There are 3 former business partners who have come forward with their own complaints. One of them, a man named Cole Rafferty, who co-owned the business from 2019 to 2021, claims Derek systematically siphoned from their joint accounts and then manipulated the books to conceal it. I sat with that. 3 partners, I said. 3 that we know of. The DA is still reviewing records. So it wasn't just me. No, Frank said quietly. It was not just you. That is a difficult thing to explain, what it felt like to hear that. Because on one level, it was more evidence, more pattern, more weight on the legal scale. But on another level, it was something I hadn't expected to feel, a terrible, complicated relief. Because I had spent months carrying a version of the question that went, what did I do wrong? What did I give him, or fail to give him, that made him this way? What was it in me, in my parenting, my softness, my willingness to cover his failures, that had produced this? And the answer, it turned out, was nothing. Nothing I had done had produced this. Derek had done this to his business partners too, people who owed him nothing, people he had no emotional history with, people whose trust he had simply identified and exploited because that was what he did. It was not about me. It was never about me. That is not a comforting truth. It is a cold and clarifying one. Your child's cruelty is not your failure. But your child's cruelty is still your child's cruelty, and that doesn't become easier to hold just because you understand it better. The DA is filing additional charges, Frank said. It changes the criminal picture significantly. Combined with the forgery charges, the bank fraud, the forged property deed, Caulfield is going to have a very difficult conversation with his client before that hearing. Does Derek know yet? I asked. The subpoena results were served to Caulfield this afternoon, Frank said. So yes, by now, yes. I thought about Derek receiving that news. I thought about the specific quality of a moment when you understand that the wall you've been pushing against isn't moving, that the story you've been telling yourself about winning isn't going to hold, that the thing you thought was a manageable situation has become something else entirely. I thought about whether I felt sorry for him. I tried to feel sorry for him. What I found was something more complicated than sorrow and less clean than anger. It was the feeling of a person standing at the end of a long road looking back at all the turns, all the places where things could have gone differently, and understanding that none of those turns were available anymore. The road was the road. The end was the end. Frank, I said, is there anything I need to do before Thursday? Just be there, he said. I'll handle everything else. All right? Mrs. Hart, how are you holding up? I thought about the honest answer. I thought about the cot in the shelter, and the cold February light through the narrow windows, and the $47 that had grown, slowly, into something slightly less desperate through the part-time billing job I'd started in January. I thought about Gloria, who had hugged me that morning with the matter-of-fact affection of someone who doesn't hug easily, but means it completely when she does. I'm holding, I said. That's the best I've got right now. That's enough, Frank said. On the morning of the hearing, I woke up at 5:15 and couldn't go back to sleep. I lay in the dark and listened to the other women breathing, and I thought about Ray. I thought about him sitting in that recliner the last night of his life, watching his baseball game, not knowing it was the last night of anything. I thought about what he would have said if he'd known what Derek had done. Ray had loved Derek with the particular, sometimes bewildered love of a quiet man who had produced a loud, mercurial child and couldn't quite figure out where the loudness had come from. He had also, and I had sometimes forgotten this in the years after Ray was gone, he had also, quietly and without fanfare, seen through Derek in ways I hadn't. He'd said it to me once, sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee, a few years before he died. Derek had just borrowed money again, and Ray had agreed to it and then sat across from me with a look I couldn't decode. What? I'd asked. Nothing, he'd said. And then, after a minute, Ev, when we're gone, that boy is going to have to face himself, and I don't think he's going to like what he sees. I hadn't known what to say to that. I'd told Ray he was being too hard on him. Lying there in the dark at 5:15 in the morning, I thought, Ray, you were right. You were right about all of it. I got up, got dressed, put on the gray blazer, and went to court. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined. Wood paneling, fluorescent lights, the particular institutional smell of old paper and floor wax. Frank was already there when I arrived, his yellow legal pad in front of him, his reading glasses on, 3 neat stacks of documents to his right. I sat beside him. Across the room, at the opposing table, was Caulfield. Compact, precise, dark suit. Beside him was Derek. Derek was wearing a jacket I didn't recognize. He'd cut his hair. He looked, on the surface, composed. But I had looked at Derek's face for 42 years, and I knew the set of his jaw when he was afraid. He was afraid. He didn't look at me when I sat down. He looked straight at the judge's bench. I watched him for a moment. This man I had brought into the world. This man I had driven myself into poverty, trying to protect and support. This man who had forged my name and drained my account and called me a harasser. And I let myself feel what I felt. It was not triumph. It was not grief. Not right then. It was something quieter and heavier. The kind of feeling that doesn't have a clean name but settles into your bones and stays. The judge entered. We stood. We sat. And then it began. The first thing Frank did was lay the amendment on the record. Clearly, methodically, without drama. Date, process, legal basis, Gerald Aldis's sworn statement, notarization records. Every piece in place, every page accounted for. The judge read through the key documents with the focused attention of someone who had seen a lot of legal filings and recognized when one was airtight. Caulfield made his arguments. He was competent and measured, and I gave him credit for that. He was working with what he had, and what he had wasn't much. The undue influence claim went first. The judge dismissed it within minutes of Frank's rebuttal, citing the specificity and detail of Aldis's documentation. The mental competency claim fared no better. Frank had obtained my medical records from 2019, clean and clear, and entered them without comment. Then the judge looked up from the documents and he looked at Caulfield, and he said something I will remember for a very long time. "Counselor, your client's name appears on a forged power of attorney from 2018 in connection with the same trust, and on a forged property deed from last year in connection with the same victim. He is currently facing criminal fraud charges in 2 separate proceedings, and you're asking this court to find that the 2019 amendment, which was executed in direct response to the 2018 incident, is invalid. Do you understand my difficulty with that argument?" Caulfield's jaw tightened slightly. "Your Honor, my client maintains—" "I understand what your client maintains," the judge said. "I'm asking if you understand why this court is not persuaded." A silence fell over the room. I looked at Derek. For the first time since I'd sat down, he looked at me. And in his eyes, in the face I had loved since before I'd seen it, since he was nothing but movement and heartbeat inside me, I saw the exact moment he understood that it was over, not a gradual realization, a single, hard moment of comprehension, like a door slamming shut. I had wanted, for a long time, to feel something triumphant in that moment. I had imagined it would feel like justice landing where it should. What it actually felt like was loss. A specific, irreversible, necessary loss. The kind you choose because the alternative is worse. The kind that doesn't stop hurting just because it was the right thing. I turned back to face the judge, and I kept my face as still as I could, and I waited for him to speak. The judge ruled from the bench. He didn't take it under advisement. He didn't schedule a follow-up hearing or request additional briefing. He looked at the documents Frank had laid before him, looked at Caulfield's increasingly thin arguments, and ruled right there in that small wood-paneled courtroom on a Thursday morning in February, while the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and I sat with my hands folded in my lap and tried to breathe normally. The amendment was valid. Derek Hart had no standing as beneficiary of the Hart Family Revocable Trust. His claim was dismissed. Frank collected his documents into neat stacks with the unhurried precision of a man who had expected exactly this outcome. Caulfield said something quietly to Derek. I couldn't hear it, but I watched Derek's face receive it. The fear I'd seen earlier had curd-pulled into something else, something tighter and darker, the expression of a person recalibrating not just a legal strategy, but something closer to their entire understanding of how the world was supposed to work. He had believed, I think genuinely believed, that the trust would be his, that whatever obstacles existed were surmountable, that he could pressure and maneuver and lawyer his way through it the same way he'd pressured and maneuvered his way through everything else in his life, including me, especially me. The judge's ruling had just told him, in the clearest possible language, that there are things you cannot maneuver through, that a document signed and notarized and filed with a competent attorney in 2019 in direct response to your own documented fraud does not bend because you want it to. I watched him understand that. I watched his jaw work once, like he was going to say something, and then go still. Caulfield touched his arm lightly and said something else. Derek stood. They walked toward the door. He passed within 10 feet of me. He didn't look at me. That was the last time I was in the same room as my son. Frank walked me to my car afterward. It was cold, a flat gray February cold, the kind that doesn't have any drama to it, just pressure. And he kept pace beside me without talking until we reached the parking structure and stopped near the stairwell. "How are you?" he asked. "I don't know yet," I said, honestly. "Ask me in a week." He nodded. He understood that some things need time to settle before you can report on them accurately. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now the criminal proceedings move forward. The DA has what they need from today's ruling. It establishes the pattern formally, on the record, in a civil proceeding. That matters for the fraud case. And Cole Rafferty's complaint, combined with the two other business partners who've since come forward, it's a significant body of evidence. 3 partners now, I said. You said 2 others. A third came forward last week. A woman named Diane Howell, who co-signed on a commercial lease with Derek in 2020. Her attorney reached out to the DA's office after news of the investigation became semi-public. Frank paused. People don't tend to come forward in isolation. One person's courage makes the next one possible. I thought about that. 3 people, each of them holding a version of the same story, the same pattern of identification and exploitation, the same careful management of trust until the moment it could be cashed in. Derek had done this not once, not twice, but as a way of operating. It was not impulsive. It was not a panic or a breakdown or a moment of weakness. It was a method. The property, I said, the trailer. The civil case for the fraudulent deed transfer is separate from today's proceeding, but benefits from it. The company that purchased the property is not fighting us. They want clean title, and they want out of a transaction that was fraudulent from the start. We're looking at a settlement that restores your ownership rights. It's not a guarantee yet, but Frank, he caught himself, smiled slightly at the slip. I mean, the trajectory is good. You said, but Frank, and then kept talking, I said. Long day, he said. He meant it as a deflection, but there was something tired and human in it that I appreciated. Thank you, I said. For all of this. He waved it off the way he always did when I thanked him, but I meant it in a way that went beyond the legal work, and I think he knew that. He had treated me from the very first meeting as a person whose situation was serious and whose choices mattered. In the months since I'd walked into his office in my gray blazer with a box of documents, that had meant more than I had the right words for. I drove back to the shelter in the flat gray cold, and I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before going in, the engine ticking as it cooled, and I let myself feel what the day had been. It was not the ending. I knew it wasn't the ending. There was still the criminal case, still the property settlement, still the long administrative process of the trust and what came next. But something had shifted, a weight redistributed, a pressure that had been sitting in the center of my chest for months, releasing just enough that I could breathe differently. I went inside. Gloria was at the front desk covering the evening check-in shift. She looked at my face when I came through the door, and she said, without preamble, "Well?" "He lost," I said. She held my gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, once, with the satisfaction of a woman who had seen too much of the world to be surprised by it, but could still appreciate it when things went right. "Good," she said. "You look hungry. There's soup left." That was Gloria. No fanfare, just soup. I ate 2 bowls. What happened to Derek in the months that followed was not something I watched happen. I want to be clear about that. I was not following his movements or tracking his circumstances with any pleasure. What I know because it was legally relevant and Frank kept me informed, or because it became public record, or because, in one case, it reached me in a way I hadn't anticipated. The criminal charges were consolidated in late February. Bank fraud, forgery of a legal document, fraudulent property transfer, and the charges connected to Cole Rafferty and the other business partners were folded into a single proceeding. Caulfield, Frank told me, had filed to withdraw from the criminal case, a signal that either Derek couldn't pay him anymore, or that Caulfield had done the math and decided the case wasn't winnable enough to be worth his reputation. Derek had a public defender briefly before retaining a different private attorney, someone Frank described as less experienced than Caulfield and considerably more aggressive in a way that didn't serve Derek's interests. The aggressive approach backfired almost immediately. In early March, Derek's new attorney filed a motion challenging the DA's evidence chain in the bank fraud case, a long-shot procedural argument that the judge denied in 2 pages and appeared to find mildly irritating. The denial contained language that Frank noted quietly was not typical of a judge who was likely to be lenient at sentencing. "He's making it worse," I said, when Frank told me. "His attorney is making it worse," Frank said, "which Derek is allowing, which amounts to the same thing." I thought about Derek's pattern, The way he had always, when cornered, pushed harder instead of reconsidering. The way challenge had never prompted reflection in him, only escalation. It was the same quality that had made him a difficult child and a difficult adult. And ultimately, a person who had dug his own grave with a series of choices that each seemed, in isolation, like they might work, but accumulated into something inescapable. "What's his financial situation?" I asked. Frank paused the way he sometimes did when he was deciding how much detail served me. "The legal fees are significant. The DA's investigation of the business accounts uncovered debts that predate what he took from you. He had borrowed against the business, and those debts are now being called in. 2 of the 3 civil complaints from his former partners have moved to judgment. The money he took from you—" Frank stopped. "I'll be direct. A portion of it is recoverable through the civil judgment. The majority has been spent." I had expected that. I had not expected it to land as heavily as it did, even knowing I'd expected it. $14,260. The number had a specific gravity that didn't diminish with familiarity. "How much is recoverable?" I asked. "Realistically, perhaps 4,000 to 6,000, depending on what assets the civil process can reach. I won't pretend that's satisfying." "It isn't," I said, "but it's something." "It's something," Frank agreed. "Oh." Cole Rafferty called me in March. I didn't know who he was when I answered. An unfamiliar number, which I'd started answering again after months of letting unknown calls go to voicemail. He identified himself carefully, explained how he'd gotten my number through his own attorney who had been in contact with Frank, said he understood if I didn't want to speak to him. "What do you want to say?" I asked. A short silence. "I wanted to apologize." That was not what I'd expected. "For what?" "You didn't do anything to me." "No," he said, "but when Derek and I were partners, there were things I noticed, things I told myself didn't mean what they looked like. And I didn't say anything to anyone. I just walked away from the partnership and told myself it was over." Another pause. "If I'd reported it then, maybe—" "Mr. Rafferty," I said. "Stop, please." He stopped. "I understand what you're saying," I told him, "but I did the same thing for 42 years. I noticed things, and I told myself they didn't mean what they looked like. You and I are not responsible for what Derek chose to do. He is." The silence on his end had a particular quality, the sound of someone hearing something they needed to hear. "How are you doing?" he asked finally. "Working on it," I said. "You?" "Same," he said. We talked for 20 minutes. He was a straightforward man, a little younger than Derek, who'd built his landscaping business through 12 years of hard work and lost nearly a third of it to Derek's manipulation before he understood what had happened. He had a wife and 2 kids and a slow, cautious way of talking that reminded me a little of Ray. Before he hung up, he said, "For what it's worth, Mrs. Hart, what you did took guts. Going through the legal process, not backing down. A lot of people in your situation wouldn't have." I thought about 3 in the morning in a diner parking lot. I thought about $47. "I didn't have much choice," I said. "Everyone has a choice," Cole Rafferty said. "That's kind of the whole point, isn't it?" I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. April arrived with the tentative, uncertain warmth of early spring in that part of the state. I had been at the shelter for nearly 6 months. I had the part-time billing job. I had Frank. I had Gloria, who was teaching me, slowly and without making a big deal of it, how to use some of the shelter's administrative software, because, as she put it, "You're too smart to be answering phones, Ev. Let's put you somewhere useful." The property settlement finalized in the first week of April. The company that had purchased the trailer, they'd actually done some upgrades in the months they'd held it, which I had complicated feelings about, agreed to the reversal of the fraudulent deed transfer. The legal mechanism was tedious and required more paperwork than I'd handled in the previous 5 years combined, but Frank walked through every page with me. I signed where I needed to sign. The county recorder processed the correction. On a Wednesday afternoon in April, Frank called me and said, "The trailer is yours again, Mrs. Hart." I was at my desk at the billing office when he called. I had to excuse myself and go stand in the hallway with my back against the wall because I didn't trust my face to stay composed. "Say that again?" I said. "The property is back in your name, as of this morning." I pressed my free hand flat against the wall behind me and felt the solidity of it. I thought about the south garden, the snap beans, the tomatoes, the particular slant of afternoon light across the back fence. I thought about Ray's recliner and whether it was still there. It wasn't. The company had cleared the furniture, but the floor underneath it was the same floor. The walls were the same walls. "Thank you, Frank," I said, for what felt like the 100th time. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "There's something else." I went still. The criminal case. A plea arrangement is being discussed. Derek's new attorney has apparently advised him, finally, the trial would not go well. The DA is open to a plea, but the terms are significant. Restitution, supervised probation, and given the pattern across multiple victims and multiple charges, the DA is not inclined toward leniency on the probation terms. Is he going to take it? I don't know yet. His attorney is posturing, but the evidence is overwhelming, and I think Derek knows it. Sometimes people take longer than they should to accept what's in front of them. I knew something about that. "Frank, whatever he decides, the criminal case, the plea, I don't need to be involved in that, do I? Beyond my victim statement? Your victim statement is important, and I'd encourage you to prepare it carefully, but beyond that, no. The DA handles the rest." "Good," I said, and I meant it. I had spent months invested in the machinery of what was happening to Derek, the filings, the hearings, the procedural details, because I had to be. Because protecting myself required it. But I was aware, sitting in that hallway at the billing office, that I was tired of living inside Derek's story. His choices, his consequences, his diminishing, desperate attempts to control something that had already slipped out of his hands. I was tired of it. I had my own story to be getting on with. Bam! I moved back into the trailer on a Saturday in late April, 3 weeks after the deed was restored. Frank had arranged for a basic furniture delivery. Nothing extravagant, a bed and a kitchen table and 2 chairs and a second-hand couch that had good bones, even if the upholstery was a color I wouldn't have chosen. Gloria drove me out there in her car, which smelled like coffee and the particular vanilla air freshener she used. And when we pulled into the gravel drive and I saw the trailer sitting there in the late afternoon light, patched and freshly painted where the company had touched it up, the south garden overgrown but recoverable, I had to sit in the passenger seat for a minute before I could get out. "Take your time," Gloria said. She turned off the engine and looked straight ahead through the windshield, giving me the space to feel what I was feeling without an audience for it. "I thought I'd never be back here," I said. "I know." "I thought he'd taken it permanently." "I know that too." I got out of the car. I walked up the 2 porch steps. The second one still creaked the same way it always had, and that creak was the most familiar sound I'd heard in 6 months. And I unlocked the door and went inside. It smelled like fresh paint and cleaning product, which was not how it used to smell. The walls were slightly different. The company had repainted everything a bland off-white. The floors were the same. The kitchen window was the same, looking out over the south garden with its tangle of dead stems and winter weeds. I stood in my kitchen for a long time. I thought about Ray, who had sat at a table in this room and said that boy is going to have to face himself, and had been right in ways neither of us had fully understood at the time. I thought about the gray box from the closet shelf. I thought about Frank's office and the county assessor's screen and the number that had changed everything. I thought about Gloria, still sitting in the car, giving me exactly the kind of time and space that nobody had given me in decades, not in a coddling way, but in the way of a person who understood that some things need to be done alone. I opened the kitchen window. The early spring air came in, cool, smelling of dirt and new grass and the particular faint sweetness of something just beginning to grow. I stood there and breathed it and felt, for the first time in longer than I could say, like I was in the right place. It wasn't repaired. It wasn't healed. There was a criminal proceeding still working its way through the system, and a south garden that needed a full season's worth of work, and a relationship with my son that was not a relationship anymore and probably never would be again. There were nights ahead that I already knew would be hard. The specific loneliness of an empty house after years of filling it with something, even something that wasn't good for me. But I was home, and I had the trust. and I had slowly and with considerable difficulty become a person who knew the difference between love and surrender. The victim's statement was the hardest thing I wrote in all of it. Frank had suggested I keep it focused. Specific incidents, specific impacts, the factual record of what Derek's actions had cost me. Judges respond to facts, he said. Emotion is fine, but ground it in the concrete. I wrote 7 drafts. The first 3 were too angry. Not dishonestly angry, but anger without structure, and anger without structure in a legal document serves no one. The 4th was too careful, too bloodless, and when I read it back, I felt like I was describing something that had happened to a stranger. The 5th was better, but too long. The 6th I abandoned halfway through. The 7th I wrote at my kitchen table on a Sunday morning with the window cracked and the garden visible beyond it, and I wrote it in one sitting without stopping. And when I finished, I read it back and it sounded like me. Not a performance of me. Not the version of me I'd spent years constructing to manage other people's comfort. Just me. 68 years old, sitting in a kitchen I'd almost lost, describing what had been done to me and what it had cost. I gave it to Frank on a Monday. He read it in front of me, which he didn't usually do with documents. He read the whole thing without speaking. When he finished, he set it down on the table between us. "This is very good," he said. "It's honest," I said. "Same thing in this context." He looked at me over his reading glasses with that expression I'd come to recognize. Not quite a smile, more like the quiet satisfaction of a man watching something arrive at its right conclusion. "Mrs. Hart," he said, "whatever happens in that sentencing hearing, you've already done the hard part." I thought about $47 in a parking lot at 3 in the morning. "Not yet," I said. He tilted his head slightly. "There's still the trust," I said, "and what I want to do with it." He leaned back. "Tell me." So I told him, and as I talked, something that had been forming quietly in the back of my mind for months, through the shelter nights and the bad coffee and the long walks in the winter cold and all the hours of sitting with my own wreckage trying to figure out what kind of person I was going to be on the other side of it, started to take the shape of something real, something that wasn't about Derek at all, something that was finally entirely mine. Frank told me later that Derek took the plea deal on a Tuesday morning in early May. I was in the South Garden when he called, on my knees in the dirt, pulling up the winter weeds that had taken over the snap bean bed, wearing Ray's old work gloves that I'd found in the shed still hanging on their nail like he'd just left them there. My phone was on the porch railing and I heard it ring and looked at Frank's name on the screen and took off one glove to answer it. "It's done," Frank said. I sat back on my heels in the dirt. He took it. This morning, guilty plea on the bank fraud, the forged deed, and 2 counts of financial fraud related to the business partner complaints. The DA agreed to drop the remaining counts in exchange. Sentencing? 6 weeks out. The judge will have the victim's statements by then. Probation is mandatory under the terms. The DA is recommending 18 months supervised, restitution to all named victims, and a prohibition on operating any financial accounts independently for the duration. Prison? I asked. I want to be honest that I didn't know, in that moment, what answer I was hoping for. I had thought about it. I had turned it over in the long nights in the trailer, listening to the quiet that was familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. The quiet of a home that had been through something and wasn't quite the same on the other side of it. I had asked myself whether I wanted Derek in a cell, and I had not been able to give myself a clean answer. The DA is not pursuing incarceration as a primary ask given the plea, Frank said carefully. Supervised probation, restitution, the financial restrictions. It's significant, Mrs. Hart. It's a real consequence. But he doesn't go to prison. Not under this arrangement, no. I looked at the garden. The weed I'd been pulling was still in my gloved hand, long roots trailing dirt. I set it down on the pile beside me. "Okay," I said. "Are you all right with that?" I thought about the question honestly, the way I'd been trying to think about everything since the shelter, without the cushioning, without the story I told myself to make things easier. "I don't know," I said, "but I think I can live with it." And I meant that in a specific way. I could live with it because the outcome was not ultimately about Derek. It had never really been about Derek. Derek's consequences were Derek's. They belonged to him the way all consequences belong to the person who earns them. What I had fought for was not his punishment. What I had fought for was myself. The restitution order includes you as the primary victim, Frank said. Given the total amount in his current asset position, the recovery will be partial, but it will be on the record and enforceable. It's enough, I said. I put the glove back on and went back to the weeding. The sentencing hearing was on a Thursday in mid-June. I submitted my victim's statement in writing it. Frank had advised that reading it aloud in court was my right, but not my obligation, and I chose not to read it myself. I had written it for the record, for the judge, for the permanent accounting of what had happened. I did not need Derek to hear my voice saying it. He knew what he had done. The statement was not for him. I did not attend the hearing. Frank called me afterward from the courthouse parking lot while I was at the billing office trying to concentrate on a spreadsheet that kept blurring at the edges because I knew the call was coming. 18 months supervised probation, he said. Restitution order of $11,000 across all named victims with a payment schedule. Financial restrictions as proposed. The judge read your statement in full and referenced it in his sentencing remarks. What did he say? Frank was quiet for a moment. He said, and I'm quoting as accurately as I can, the victim in this case is a 68-year-old woman who lost her home, her savings, and her sense of safety at the hands of someone she had spent her entire adult life protecting. The court notes that the pattern of behavior documented here is not the result of desperation or circumstance. It is the result of sustained, deliberate exploitation of trust. The sentence reflects that finding. I pressed my lips together and looked at my computer screen. He read it, I said. He read every word. I thought about the 7th draft, written on a Sunday morning with the window cracked and the smell of new grass coming in. I thought about all 6 drafts before it, the anger and the bloodlessness and the abandoned halfway versions, and how none of them had sounded like me, and the 7th one had, and how that had mattered more than I'd expected it to. Thank you, Frank, I said. And then, because I was tired of the word being insufficient, I mean that in a bigger way than I can say right now. I know, he said. Go home, Mrs. Hart. Plant something. I laughed. It surprised me. The realness of it, the way it came up without warning. I'm already 3 weeks into the snap beans, I told him. Good, he said. That's exactly right. Now, I need to tell you about the trust, about what I told Frank I wanted to do with it, that Monday morning at his office with the South Garden visible in my head and the 7th draft of the victim's statement still sitting between us on the table. The Tiller County land, the scrubby, remote acreage that Ray's Uncle Clarence had left behind without a will, and that Ray had quietly, stubbornly protected in a trust that nobody had paid much attention to for 2 decades. Had become valuable in a way that none of us had anticipated in 2001. The development moving through that part of the county had changed the calculus entirely. The assessed value was significant, not life-changing for a billionaire significant, but genuinely, substantially significant for a 68-year-old woman who had $47 in her account 6 months earlier. I had lain awake thinking about it for weeks before I knew what I wanted to do. Part of what I'd lain awake thinking about was the shelter. The 6 months I'd spent at Millhaven, the cot, the institutional coffee, the folding tables, the women who sat across from me with their own versions of my story. The thing that had struck me over and over during those months was how many of them there were. How many women in their 50s, 60s, 70s, women who had worked and built and sacrificed and been carefully, deliberately stripped of what they'd built, were sleeping in those beds. Not because they were weak or foolish, because they had loved people who took advantage of love, because they had trusted people who treated trust as a resource to be mined. The shelter had a waiting list. It always had a waiting list. Gloria had told me that in my first week, matter-of-factly, without drama, because that was how Gloria told you things that should outrage you, plainly, so the outrage could land clean. We turn people away every week, she'd said. There isn't room. I had thought about that a lot. I had also thought about what happened after the shelter. After the 6 weeks or 3 months or whatever the stay permitted, when a woman walked out the door with a suitcase and a bus pass and nowhere permanent to go. The shelter stabilized you. It gave you a floor. But a floor isn't a home, and the gap between a shelter bed and actual stable housing, the gap that swallowed people whole, that sent them cycling back, that made the waiting list perpetual, that gap was where the real damage happened. So I told Frank what I wanted. I wanted to use a portion of the trust to establish a small housing fund, not a grand institutional operation, something specific and manageable, subsidized rental units for women over 60 in financial crisis, the kind of crisis that came from exactly what had happened to me. Exploited by family, robbed by people they'd loved, left without the assets they'd spent their lives building because the law moved slowly and shame moved faster. I wanted there to be somewhere for them to go that wasn't a cot in a room with 5 other people, somewhere that gave them the stability to fight back, to do what I had done, to go through the documents and find the lawyers and hold the line, without the daily terror of not knowing where they'd sleep. Frank had listened to all of this without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "That's a significant undertaking," he said. "I know. You'd need proper nonprofit structure, legal setup, operational framework. It's not simple." "I know that too. It'll take time to set up correctly." "I have time," I said. "I'm 68, not dead." He almost smiled. "No, you are certainly not. Will you help me?" He picked up his yellow legal pad. "Tell me more about what you're envisioning," he said. It took 8 months. I want to say that accurately. 8 months of paperwork, nonprofit filings, conversations with housing authorities and county officials, and the kind of bureaucratic process that makes you understand why most people don't do things like this. There were weeks when it felt like every step forward came with 2 sideways steps into a process I didn't fully understand and had to learn from scratch. Frank guided the legal structure. A woman named Adrienne Cho, who ran a small community development organization in Mill Haven and whom Frank introduced me to in July, guided the operational side with a patience that I hope I adequately thanked her for. I made mistakes. I underestimated costs on the initial budget twice. I chose a contractor for the first unit renovations who turned out to be a problem. Not a crisis, but a delay, and a reminder that nothing about doing something real and difficult is smooth. I had conversations with county housing officials that left me exhausted and occasionally furious. I had weeks where I wondered if I had overestimated what I was capable of at my age. Gloria told me on one of those weeks, in her flat and unerring way, "You're not doing this because it's easy. You're doing it because it needs doing. Those are different reasons and they require different kinds of stubbornness." "What kind of stubbornness does this require?" I asked. "The kind that doesn't need to feel good every day," she said. "The kind that just keeps moving." I kept moving. By February of the following year, 1 year, almost exactly, from the morning I had sat in that courtroom and watched Derek understand that the wall wasn't moving, the first 2 units were ready. Small, clean, modest. Nothing luxurious, but private and stable and real. 2 women moved in within the first week. One who had been at Mill Haven for 4 months, one who had been cycling through temporary situations for longer than that, both of them in their 60s, both of them with complicated legal situations involving family and assets and the slow machinery of courts that were not yet resolved. I visited the units the day before the first residents arrived. I stood in the smaller of the 2, a 1-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a building on Whitmore Street, 3 blocks from the shelter where I had spent 6 months of my own life, and looked at the clean walls and the new locks on the door and the window that looked out over a parking lot that was not beautiful but was solid and real. I thought about the night I'd driven to the shelter with my suitcase and 2 garbage bags of belongings. I thought about the intake worker who had asked the necessary questions without an ounce of pity. I thought about the towel and the small bag with the toothbrush. The way structure, when you're in free fall, feels like being caught. I wanted this to be that. Not glamorous, not perfect, just caught. The restitution payments from Derek began in September. Small amounts, the payment schedule reflected his diminished circumstances, but regular because the probation terms required regularity and the financial restrictions made evasion difficult. Each payment was a formality by that point. The trust had rendered the lost $14,000 a fraction of the overall picture. But I didn't refuse the payments, and I didn't redirect them. I put them in a separate account, And when enough accumulated, I used them for something specific, a small library of legal and financial resources for the housing program's residents. Practical things, guides to estate planning, tenant rights, elder financial protection. The kind of information that, if I had had it earlier, might have changed things. I labeled the shelf with a plain index card that said, "Know what you have, know your rights, know when to ask for help, no attribution, no drama. Just the information, available to anyone who needed it." Gloria came to see the units on a Saturday in March, a full year and a half after I'd walked into the shelter on a winter night with nowhere to go. She stood in the small common area between the two units and looked around with the expression I'd come to know well. That particular Gloria expression that was not quite approval and not quite pride, but something more fundamental. The look of a person who has watched a lot of things fail and is acknowledging carefully that this particular thing has not. "It's not enough," she said. "I know," I said. "There are 30 women on the shelter's waiting list right now." "I know that too." She looked at me. "You're going to try to do more." "When I can," I said. "One unit at a time." She nodded slowly. "You know what your problem is, Ev? I'm sure you're going to tell me. You spent 40 years pouring yourself into the wrong place," she said. "Now you've found the right one and you can't stop." I thought about that. "Is that a problem?" I asked. "No," she said. "It's just who you are." Check. I think about Derek sometimes. I want to be honest about that because the dishonest version of this story, the version where I moved on completely and cleanly, where the love just switched off and the grief resolved into something tidy, that version would be a lie, and I've spent enough of my life telling myself comfortable lies. I think about him, not every day anymore, but sometimes, when the light hits a certain way in the late afternoon, or when I'm at the kitchen table with my coffee and the window is open, or when I find something in a drawer that I'd forgotten about from before, a receipt in his handwriting, a photograph from when he was 8, grinning at the camera with a gap where his front tooth had been, holding up a fish he'd caught at the pond behind Ray's brother's property. The boy in that photograph and the man who called me a harasser are the same person. I've had to learn to hold both of those truths at once without letting either one cancel the other out. The boy was real. The love was real. And what the man did was also real. All three things are true. None of them erase each other. I don't know what Derek's life looks like now, in the specific practical details. The probation period is ongoing. The restitution payments come. Beyond that, I don't know, and I've made a deliberate choice not to know more than comes to me on its own. Not out of anger, or not only anger, out of self-preservation, out of the recognition that some doors, once you've had the strength to close them, you leave closed. Not because you hate what's on the other side, but because you finally understand that opening them again costs more than you have. What I know is this: he built his life on sand, and the tide came in. Not because anyone pushed it, not because I sought revenge or wished destruction on him. The tide came in because tides come in. Because actions accumulate, because the specific fraud of treating people's love as a resource, of identifying where someone is soft and pressing there again and again until you've taken everything that softness would give, is not a sustainable way to live. It catches up. Maybe not as fast as it should, maybe not in the way you'd script it if you were writing the story, but it catches up. His did. But I am 69 years old now, writing this in my kitchen on an October morning with the window cracked and the south garden visible beyond it, looking considerably better than it did 18 months ago. The snap beans came in strong this past summer. The tomatoes were inconsistent. Some years are just inconsistent. But I got enough for 2 rounds of canning and a batch of sauce that I gave 3 jars of to Gloria, who said it was too sweet and then came back for a 4th jar the following week. The housing program has 4 units now. We have a waiting list of our own, which is not what I wanted, but is the reality of need versus resource. Adrienne is helping me apply for a small county grant that could fund 2 more units by next year. Frank reviews every contract. Patricia Hess, Gerald Aldis's former colleague, has become the trust managing attorney, a role she took on with the methodical enthusiasm of a person who recognizes when a thing is worth doing carefully. The trailer has been home again for over a year. It is not the same as before. Some things can be physically restored and still not feel quite the same, and I have learned to accept that without needing it to be otherwise. The second porch step still creaks. The kitchen window still looks out over the garden. Ray's recliner is gone, but the floor beneath where it stood is the same floor. I have put a different chair there, a plain wooden one that I bought secondhand and refinished myself over 2 weekends, badly the first time and better the second time. And it is not the recliner, but it is mine, and I chose it, and that matters in ways I couldn't have articulated a year and a half ago. I have 4 people I consider genuine friends now: Gloria, Adrienne, Cole Rafferty, and his wife Karen, who invited me to dinner in August and whose kitchen table I sat at for 3 hours eating good food and talking about nothing consequential and feeling, for the length of that evening, like a normal person living a normal life. I do not take that feeling for granted. I have learned at 69 that ordinary evenings are the thing. Not the dramatic moments, not the vindications, not the courtroom rulings or the document revelations. Those things matter. But they are not the life. The life is ordinary evenings around tables with people who are glad you're there. It took me losing everything to understand that. I wish I'd understood it sooner. I suspect most people who understand it deeply learned it the same hard way. Well, I want to talk to you directly now because I said at the beginning that I was telling this story because someone out there needed to hear it, and I think I owe you the part where I say what I actually mean. If you are reading this, and you are in the situation I was in, not necessarily the same situation, but a version of it, any version of it, the version where you have been giving and covering and forgiving and calling it love when it has stopped being love, I want you to hear this. The money can sometimes be recovered. The property can sometimes be restored. Those things are real, and they matter, and you should fight for them with everything you have. But the most important thing I got back was not the trailer, and it was not the trust. It was the knowledge that I had the right to protect myself, that my life, my assets, my dignity, at 68, at 69, at whatever age you are right now, belong to me. Not to the person who raised their voice, not to the person who called your protection harassment, not to the person who practiced your signature on a piece of paper because they calculated that your love for them was more powerful than your sense of self-preservation. They were wrong. I was wrong too, for 42 years. Wrong to think that love required me to be permeable, to have no edges, to absorb whatever was done to me without resistance. I called that love. It wasn't love. It was fear dressed in love's clothing. Fear of being alone, fear of being the bad one, fear of the silence on the other end of the phone if I ever said, enough, no more. Here's what I know now. Enough is a complete sentence. No more is not cruelty. A boundary is not abandonment. Protecting what is yours does not make you selfish. It makes you someone who will still be standing when the storm is over, with something left to build from. I am standing, I am building, and I am doing it without asking permission from the person who told me I never could. Some people will come back to you when they lose. They'll call, the way Derek called from that quiet, sleepless place, wanting to negotiate, wanting to make the consequences smaller by re-engaging your emotions. They'll use the language of family. They'll use the past. They'll use your love against you one more time because it's the only currency they have left. You're allowed to not answer. You're allowed to say, through my attorney. You're allowed to say, goodbye. You're allowed to hang up the phone and sit in the silence afterward and feel whatever you feel. The grief, the relief, the complicated mixture of the two that doesn't have a clean name, and not owe anyone an explanation for any of it. The people who truly love you will not require you to destroy yourself to prove it. And if the person who has been taking from you all this time is reading this somehow, and I don't imagine they are, but if they are, I want to say this too. It is not too late to be different. It is not too late to face yourself honestly, the way Ray said you would have to eventually, and decide to be someone whose life is built on what they actually earned. That path is harder and slower and less immediately satisfying than the one you've been on, but it ends somewhere you can live with. The other path ends where Derek ended up, standing in a courtroom, watching a judge read about everything you took, knowing that the people you burned through to get there are building lives that don't include you. That is not a life. That is a series of transactions that ran out of counterparties. You can choose differently. That choice is always available, but it has to be a real choice made with real accountability, not another performance designed to get something from someone who has finally stopped being available to take from. I planted the snap beans early this year, March, which is probably too early for this part of the country, and I knew it when I was doing it, but I did it anyway because I wanted to, because I felt like it, because it was my garden and my timing and my choice, and if they don't come in right, I'll plant them again. The second porch step creaked this morning when I went out to check them. It creaks the same way it has for 30 years, and it will probably creak the same way for 30 more. And I find I love that creak with a specificity and a gratitude that I could not have articulated before all of this. The ordinary, stubborn permanence of a creaking step, the fact that some things hold, the snap beans are coming up, the trust is intact. I am 69 years old and I am still here, still building, still choosing what to do with whatever time I have. That is everything. That is the whole point. That is enough.